And or could this war be made unsustainable for the Russians because of the sheer extraordinary casualties? Keep in mind that in the first year of this war, the Russians lost perhaps as much as 5 times the soldiers in a single year that the Soviet Union lost in Afghanistan in a decade. When does this become unsustainable? When is the damage on the battlefield and on the home front due to the financial, economic, and personal sanctions and export controls and the loss, now probably 1 million or more Russian citizens, 500,000 of them their best and brightest who left early on, and others that are leaving rather than go to the conscript stations? When does this become unsustainable? The truth is, it's an unanswerable question, and I think even the great director of analysis for a number of years probably couldn't do this with high confidence, answer this. But that's sort of where we are, of course, after a year that saw Russia lose the Battle of Kyiv, lose the Battle of Sumy and Chernihiv, lose the Battle of Kharkiv, lose the Battle of Kherson, and lose everybody who was east of the Dnipro River, and again take staggering losses and lose well over half of their entire tank fleet, to the point that they are now pulling out of mothballs T-55 tanks, which are basically a World War II era tank. I mean, they're getting desperate and they can't get the replacements for that, at least, although they are able, unfortunately, to get drones from Iran that have proved to be quite damaging. So the question, I think, the central question is, can the U.S. continue to lead this effort? I believe we can, in a way that keeps Congress with us. I think we can, despite certain elements of the Republicans in the House being opposed to this. Keep the rest of NATO with them. I think we can, and the rest of the West, noting that there's some pretty substantial groups in the South, if you will, that are not with this. And that's I was just in India for a week with the Trilateral Commission, and I'm made keenly aware by them in particular that, of course, many other countries are sitting this out, basically, and or taking advantage of reduced rates for natural gas, crude oil, minerals, and so forth from Russia. But that's where we stand. And I think, again, I should point out, I am truly non-political. I don't even register to vote. I stopped when I was promoted to 2 stars and never resumed. I advise members of either party if they're responsible. I was very critical of this administration for withdrawing from Afghanistan, which I thought there were alternatives. I felt it was going to be a disastrous outcome, and I believe that, sadly, that has been validated. But I think in this case, the administration deserves actually quite high marks for what it is that they've guided around the world as well as from here. So in the case of Ukraine, I think, again, the U.S. and Western response has been really quite extraordinary. Now, I was at the Munich Security Conference last year, a few days before the invasion began, and I felt a sense of unity there that I hadn't felt since I was a speechwriter for the Supreme Allied Commander back during the Cold War days. Nothing like it since then. And of course, the irony of this is that in setting out to make Russia great again, what Putin has really done is make NATO great again, even adding 2 new members, one of which is certain to come in very shortly now, Finland, and the other will over time, I think, Sweden as well. And it has galvanized certain countries. What Germany has done, this, whatever the name is for a lightning bolt that they have in German, quite an extraordinary development there, among a number of others as well. Where are we now in Ukraine? We are temporarily in a bit of a stalemate. The Director of Analysis can grade my work here in a moment. But essentially, Russia has been throwing soldiers, not very skillfully, not achieving combined arms effects, at Bakhmut and a couple of other locations in the southeastern part of the country, almost encircling 2 of these, but not quite, and Ukraine forcing them to bleed very, very heavily for them. It may be that Russia ultimately is able to own Bakhmut and perhaps the other location that's embattled. If they do, they will have paid an incredible price for communities that are completely destroyed. Now, President Zelensky is determined not to let them have it if he can. He sees the symbolic importance of this. He's spoken about that. But what we really need to watch is not what's happening on the battlefield right now. It's what's happening at training centers that U.S. runs in Germany, Grafenwehr Hohenfels, UK, Poland, Ukraine itself, where entire new brigades are being established, largely with new recruits from Ukraine, but also with some seasoned commissioned and non-commissioned officers. Over time, will be equipped with Western tanks or with the residual Soviet bloc systems, Western infantry fighting vehicles, Western wheeled armored vehicles, really quite an extraordinary array of systems. And this late May, early June, there is going to be a heck of an offensive from the Ukrainians, very likely in the south. It probably has to be roughly the Melitopol area. And they will try to sever the ground line of communications that Russia has established along the southeast coast of Ukraine, linking into Crimea. I believe that they are going to achieve, for the first time in this war, true combined arms effects, because they will, for the first time, Russians have not at all done this. They've failed from day one. They have sent tanks just right down the road without infantry. The Ukrainians will have tanks with infantry and infantry fighting vehicles, keeping the enemy's infantry and their anti-tank guided missiles off those tanks. They will have engineers and EOD to reduce obstacles and defuse explosives and mines. They will have air defense to keep the Russian air off them. They'll have electronic warfare to jam the Russians' networks. They'll have artillery and mortars to suppress the enemy forces. They'll have good command and control. They'll have logistics pushed right up behind them with additional arms, ammunition, or arms, fuel, water, food, medical support. And they'll have reserve forces, which they did not have in the offensive in the Kharkiv area last fall. That was very impressive, but basically culminated, ran out of steam, because human beings can only go for about 72 hours-ish before they just physically no longer have any capacity to do much on the battlefield. We reached that point, by the way. We proved this during the fight to Baghdad a couple of different times. I believe that's what's going to happen. And the question then, and we might actually ask the DA privately later, the question then is, can Putin over time be convinced that he will not be able to outsuffer the Ukrainians, the Europeans, and the Americans, which is what he currently thinks. He thinks that, again, Russians, just like they did to Napoleon's army and the Nazis, that they're going to prevail over time because they have more fortitude. My sense is that although he has rattled the saber on a number of occasions, most recently now deploying nuclear weapons to Belarus, which really doesn't matter at all. I mean, it's immaterial whether they're in Russian soil or Belarusian soil, that these are to some degree acts of desperation, just trying anything to divide the West, to drive a wedge between Europe and North America or what have you. But that because of the response of the United States, our allies and partners, and perhaps most significantly, President Xi of China and Prime Minister Modi of India, both of whom cautioned him against using nuclear weapons quite firmly, and reportedly in this most recent visit that President Xi had in Moscow as well. And the U.S. National Security Advisor, an understated guy,